She was 17 years old. She ran the fastest 2 miles of any girl in 3 counties, and she wrote every one of those miles down in a red spiral notebook she carried everywhere she went. On the evening of October 4th, 2001, Emily Rourke finished practice, waved goodbye to the last of her teammates, and walked toward the far edge of the school parking lot. She was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a girl who ran away from a small Vermont town. That is a story about the one man everybody trusted. The man who spoke at her memorial. The man who coached her friends and their younger brothers and sisters after them, and wore her race number stitched into his jacket for 22 years. And it is the story of a single thing he never imagined would survive. The one piece of evidence that finally told the truth about who he really was. It would take 2 decades. It would take a detective who was told to let the file go and refused. And in the end, it would take a paper coffee cup pulled from a trash can behind a diner on a Tuesday morning. But before we get to the day they came for him, you have to go back to Marin. You have to understand who Emily was. And you have to understand why an entire town spent 22 years grieving the wrong story. Marin, Vermont, sits in a fold of the Green Mountains, where the roads still turn to dirt a mile past the last streetlight. In the autumn of 2001, it was the kind of place where people left their front doors unlocked and their keys in the ignition, because the worst thing anyone could remember happening was a barn fire back in the 70s. 900 people. 1 blinking traffic light. A general store that still ran a paper tab for families who were short that month. When the leaves turned, the whole valley went gold and rust and deep red, and the smell of wood smoke settled over Main Street like something you could lean against. That fall, the country was still raw. It was 3 weeks after the 11th of September, and the little white church on the hill rang its bell every evening at 6. People kept the radio on low. Cell phones were the size of a shoe and only worked on the Ridge Road, and half the town still didn't own one. In Marin, if you wanted to find someone, you drove to their house. Emily Rourke was the kind of kid a small town builds its hopes around. She was the only daughter of Tom and Diane Rourke, who ran the hardware store, and the little sister of a brother, Ben, who was away at his first year of college. She was a senior. She was the anchor of the Marin High cross-country team, and she was good enough that letters from colleges had started arriving in the mailbox, addressed to her in careful cursive. But the thing everyone remembered about Emily was the notebook. A red spiral notebook, worn soft at the corners, where she logged every single run, the distance, the time, the weather, and 1 line at the bottom about how it felt. She'd been keeping it since she was 13. She said the notebook was how she'd know she was getting better, even on the days it didn't feel like it. She laced her left shoe first, every time, a small superstition her father used to tease her about. She wanted to run for a university somewhere with mountains. She was, by every account, about 2 years away from the life she'd planned out mile by mile. Her coach was a man named Dale Fenner. He'd taken over the Marin High track and cross-country program that very fall, a young, energetic coach who ran drills alongside the kids and stayed late to lock up so the team could get in extra loops before dark. Parents loved him. He knew every runner's split times by heart. He'd organize pasta dinners at his own house before meets. In a town that had waited a long time for someone to care about its kids, Dale Fenner looked like an answer to a prayer. On the afternoon of October 4th, Emily kissed her mother goodbye at the store and said she'd be home by dinner. It was a Thursday. She had practice. That was the last time Diane Rourke saw her daughter's face. Practice ended a little after 5. the light was already going. The other runners drifted toward the parking lot in twos and threes, pulling on sweatshirts, and by 5:20 most of the cars were gone. Emily stayed behind to run one more loop of the field. She told a teammate she wanted to add a mile. The teammate, a sophomore named Katie, remembered waving to her from a departing station wagon. Emily waved back. She was standing at the edge of the lot with her gym bag over her shoulder and the red notebook tucked under her arm. It was 5:35. It was the last confirmed sighting of Emily Rourke alive. At 6:45, Diane put dinner on the table. Emily's chair stayed empty. By 7:15, Diane had called the school, the coach's house, and 3 of Emily's friends. No one had seen her since practice. By 8:00, Tom Rourke was driving the Ridge Road with his high beams on, slowing at every driveway, and Diane was standing on the porch with the phone in her hand, watching the road. By 9:00, half of Marin was out with flashlights. They searched all night. Men walked the tree line behind the school, calling her name into the dark. The volunteer fire department dragged the shallow end of Pratt Pond. Coach Fenner was there before anyone else, they'd later say, the first to organize the volunteers into grids, the last to go home when the sun came up. He'd found Emily's gym bag near the equipment shed at the edge of the athletic field, sitting neatly upright as if she'd set it down for a moment. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anything. The red notebook was not in the bag. It was never found. 3 days passed. Then a hunter named Everett Doyle, walking his dog along an old logging road 4 miles north of town, found her. Emily Rourke was in a shallow depression just off the road, covered with leaves and cut brush. She had been strangled. The medical examiner would later place her death within hours of when she was last seen. The town of 900 people stopped breathing all at once. The case landed with the county sheriff's department and a young state trooper named Rebecca Torrance, who had grown up 2 valleys over and had never worked a homicide in her life. She would work this one, in one form or another, for the next 22 years. From the start, the investigation was hobbled by exactly the thing that made Marin feel safe. Nothing like this had ever happened here, and no one was ready for it. The logging road where Emily was found had been walked over by a dozen searchers before anyone thought to treat it as a scene. It rained the second night. Whatever tire impressions might have been there were gone by morning. Still, there were fragments. Under Emily's fingernails, the medical examiner recovered a small amount of biological material that did not belong to her. It was carefully preserved, a swab, sealed and logged and placed in an evidence envelope. In 2001, in a rural Vermont county, that swab was close to useless. The technology to build a usable profile from so small a sample barely existed, and even where a profile could be built, there was no database in the world to compare it against, unless you already had a suspect to match it to. So investigators went looking for a suspect. They looked hard at a boyfriend, a quiet boy named Cole who'd taken Emily to a homecoming dance the year before. He'd been at his grandmother's in Rutland the whole evening, with 6 people to say so. They cleared him. They looked at a drifter who'd been seen hitchhiking on Route 12 that week, and spent 2 months trying to find him before learning he'd been in a county lockup in New Hampshire the night Emily died. They looked at every registered offender within 40 miles. Nothing fit, and through all of it, standing just off to the side, was Coach Dale Fenner, helpful, devastated, always available. He gave a long statement. He'd left the school around 5:15, he said, before Emily finished her extra loop. He'd stopped for gas, then gone home. No one could quite confirm the timing, but no one had any reason to doubt him either. He was the coach. He was the man who'd organized the search. When investigators asked the town who might have wanted to hurt Emily Rourke, the answer was always the same. Nobody, everybody loved that girl. The trooper, Rebecca Torrance, wrote one line in her notebook that she would return to for 2 decades. Fenner last adult with regular contact. Timeline soft. She had nothing else. She had a sealed swab and a soft feeling, and in 2001, neither one was enough. The file went cold. Years have a way of moving through a small town without ever really leaving. The Rourkes kept the hardware store open. Tom got quieter. Diane kept Emily's bedroom exactly as it was. The running shoes still lined up by the door. The college letters still in the drawer. Ben came home from school changed and moved away and came back only for holidays. The family kept a candle in the store window every October 4th. The town grieved the only way it knew how, by turning Emily into something permanent. The school retired her race number. There was a scholarship in her name, given each year to a graduating runner, and every autumn, Marin held the Emily Rourke Memorial Run, a 2-mile loop through the gold and rust of the valley, ending at the football field where she'd been last seen. And every year, at the front of that race, organizing the volunteers and reading Emily's name aloud to the crowd, was Coach Dale Fenner. He never left. He coached for another 2 decades. He was named the state's high school coach of the year, twice. He founded a summer running camp for younger kids. He wore a jacket with Emily's number stitched over the heart, and when a new group of freshmen joined the team each fall, he would gather them and tell them, gently, about the girl they ran for. Grief made him beloved. It made him untouchable. To suspect Dale Fenner would have felt, to the people of Marin, like suspecting the memorial itself. The only person who never fully let go was Rebecca Torrance. She rose through the ranks, made detective, and every few years she'd pull the Rourke file and read it again. She kept a photograph of Emily on the corner of her desk, the one from the newspaper, a girl mid-stride, notebook in hand, caught in a moment of pure motion. Colleagues told her to let it go. She never did. If you've ever had a case, or a question, or a person you couldn't stop thinking about, you understand what kept her going. And if stories like Emily's are the kind you think deserve to be finished, take a second to subscribe before we get to the part where everything changed. Because what broke this case open didn't come from a witness, or a confession, or a deathbed note. It came from a family tree. By the early 2020s, a new kind of detective work had started closing cases that everyone had given up on. It's called investigative genetic genealogy, and the idea behind it is simpler than it sounds. When investigators have DNA from a crime scene, but no match in the criminal database, they can now compare that DNA to the enormous public databases that ordinary people upload to when they research their ancestry. You don't need the suspect to have ever taken a test. You only need a distant cousin, a second cousin, a third who did. From there, genealogists build the family tree backward and forward until the branches narrow to a single name. In 2022, Vermont's Cold Case Unit received grant funding to retest aging evidence. Detective Torrance, now 2 years from retirement, made sure the Rourke swab was near the top of the list. The sample was small and old, but the science had caught up to it. A profile was built. It was uploaded to a genealogy database late that fall. And for a long time, nothing happened. Then, in the spring of 2023, a match came back. A distant one. A woman in Ohio who had no idea her DNA was about to matter to anyone. A genealogist began the slow work of climbing her tree, filling in 100 years of marriages and births and death records. The branches spread, then began to close. They narrowed to a family that had lived in central Vermont for generations. They narrowed to 2 brothers. And then, because one brother had been overseas in the military in October of 2001, they narrowed to one. The name at the end of the tree was Dale Fenner. Detective Torrance read it 3 times. Then, she sat very still. The man at the front of every memorial race. The coach with the number stitched over his heart. The first volunteer at the search, and the last to leave. A genealogical match is a lead, not a conviction. To be certain, investigators needed Fenner's own DNA directly, and they weren't ready to knock on his door and warn him. So they waited, and they watched. On a Tuesday morning, Dale Fenner stopped at a diner on Main Street, drank his coffee at the counter the way he had for 30 years, and dropped the empty cup in the trash on his way out. A detective walked in 10 minutes later and took it. The lab confirmed it 8 days later. The DNA under Emily Rourke's fingernails belonged to her coach. By then, Dale Fenner was 61 years old and preparing to retire. The town had planned a ceremony. The gymnasium was going to be named after him. There were posters in the school hallway. The Emily Rourke Memorial Run, that October, was to be dedicated in his honor, a tribute to the man who had carried her memory for 22 years. He was arrested 4 days before the ceremony. They took him in the parking lot of Marin High School, in the same lot where Emily Rourke was last seen alive, a few hundred feet from the equipment shed where her gym bag had been found sitting upright. He did not run. Witnesses said he simply set down the box of team equipment he was carrying and put his hands behind his back, as if some part of him had been waiting 22 years for the sound of that particular car pulling in. The news moved through Marin the way the searchers once had, house to house in the dark. People refused to believe it. Some of them still don't. The man had shaped a generation of kids. He'd stood at the graves and read the names. And that, investigators would later say, was the whole architecture of it. The safest place to hide was inside the town's grief. For 22 years, the person leading the search for Emily's killer had been the one thing no one thought to search. What happened that October evening in 2001 has never been fully explained, and maybe it never will be. What the evidence showed was enough. Prosecutors laid out the genealogy, the coffee cup, the fingernail sample, and the soft timeline that a young trooper had flagged in her notebook 2 decades earlier. Dale Fenner was charged with second-degree murder. A jury needed less than a day. He is serving a sentence he will not outlive. The red spiral notebook was never found. I want to leave you with Emily, though, and not with him. Because the last image of this story shouldn't be a man in a parking lot with his hands behind his back. It should be a 17-year-old girl at the edge of a gold Vermont valley, in the last good light of an October afternoon, lacing her left shoe first and heading out for 1 more mile because she wanted to be a little better than she was yesterday. That's who she was. That's who she stayed, in the mind of everyone who loved her. For all the years the truth was hiding. Tom Rourke did not live to see the arrest. He passed in 2019. Diane did. When the verdict came in, she stood outside the courthouse and said only that she could finally take the candle out of the store window, because Emily was coming home now, in the only way left to her. The scholarship still runs every year. The memorial race still winds through the valley each October. But now, when they read her name aloud at the starting line, there is no one standing at the front of the crowd pretending to grieve. There's a particular kind of evil that doesn't run and doesn't hide in the shadows. It stays. It volunteers. It carries the coffin and comforts the mother and wears the number over its heart. And it counts on the fact that no one looks closely at the person who seems to care the most. Emily Rourke's killer was caught not because he slipped up, but because a girl who logged every mile of her life left behind one last trace under her fingernails, and because one detective refused to believe the tidy story the whole town had agreed to tell. It makes you wonder, how many towns are quietly protecting the wrong person right now? How many memorials are built by the very hands that made them necessary? And if it took a distant cousin in Ohio and a coffee cup in a trash can to catch a man hiding in plain sight for 22 years, how many others are still out there, still standing at the front of the crowd? If this story stayed with you, leave Emily's name in the comments so it's said one more time. Subscribe so the next family that's been waiting 20 years for an answer doesn't wait in silence. And take care of yourselves out there, because the person you should keep an eye on is not always the stranger on the Ridge Road. Sometimes, it's the one everybody trusts.